What you're about to see is the moment a teenage girl realized she wasn't walking free. Her tears weren't enough to erase what she'd done, or who she'd taken. Seconds before the gavel fell, she looked up, believing mercy might still be waiting. But mercy never came. This is the story of how friendship, trust, and one night changed everything. It began long before the courtroom, before the tears and the gavel's echo. It began in the small, familiar hum of Morgantown, a place of close neighborhoods, Friday football games, and best friends who promised forever. Skylar Neese was born on February 10, 1996, an only child with a quick wit and a laugh that carried through the walls of her family's apartment. She was the kind of girl who remembered birthdays, wrote notes to friends for no reason, and loved harder than the world was ready for. At University High, she was known for her honesty and spark, though sometimes that same honesty made her stand out in ways teenagers don't always appreciate. By the time she was 16, she had two constants in her orbit: Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Together, they were the trio everyone envied. They finished each other's sentences, shared secrets, swapped clothes, and spent long nights mapping out dreams that, to them, felt unstoppable. The summer of 2011 was theirs. They filled their phones with selfies, inside jokes, and laughter that seemed endless. Skylar's parents adored seeing her smile again after stressful school days, trusting that her friends were good influences, the kind of girls who'd look after each other. The girls posted about friendship bracelets and road trips, recording memories of slumber parties lit by fairy lights and shared whispers that stretched past midnight. On those nights, nothing felt wrong. Nothing hinted at the distance forming in quiet corners of their friendship. But looking back, anyone who watched their videos could see it. The way Skylar sometimes smiled slower, laughed a second later, or the uncomfortable flicker in her eyes when Sheila took center stage. Sheila Eddy was magnetic, the kind of teenager who seemed to control the weather in a room. People followed her lead, charm wrapped tight around confidence. Rachel Schoaf, on the other hand, was soft-spoken and quick to agree, content to orbit between the two, her loyalty bending whichever way acceptance leaned that day. Skylar balanced them, the rational voice when plans went too far and the conscience when tempers flared. But that balance was starting to shift. By late 2011, minor disagreements became cold shoulders. Sheila wanted control. Skylar wanted honesty. Rachel hated conflict and hated being caught in the middle even more. By March 2012, classmates noticed subtle changes that didn't make headlines but told their own story. The trio wasn't inseparable anymore. Skylar started spending lunch breaks with other friends, sometimes sitting alone in the cafeteria, head down over a paperback novel. On social media, small messages hinted at her disappointment. Tweets written late at night, honest but cryptic, sick of being left out. Too bad they're not who they pretend to be. Each one carried the voice of a girl trying to be heard without telling the world how deeply she felt the fracture. Her parents saw it too, less laughter, more time spent alone in her room. But like most parents, they chalked it up to growing pains, trusting that teenage friendships just worked that way. Hot one week, cold the next. Sheila and Rachel still came over, smiles intact, charm perfectly staged. They took pictures by Skylar's window, giggled on her couch, and texted constantly when apart. Yet something invisible lingered in the gaps between their laughter. Something heavy, unspoken. Skylar's father remembered later that when Sheila visited, she always seemed to take in the Neese home like she was memorizing it. He brushed it off at the time. After all, these were teenage girls. But something about their closeness had changed. It was no longer about inclusion. It was about control. By early summer of 2012, the trio was barely holding together. Skylar still wanted to believe things could return to the way they were, to the nights they laughed until dawn, when trust still meant something. But trust was a thread already worn thin. Tension wasn't loud. It hid inside small gestures, the cold glance, the missed text, the empty space between their group photos. Skylar wasn't naive, though. She saw it building quietly, felt her friends slipping away and pretending nothing was wrong. She wrote once in frustration that you can't lose friends who were never true. No one could have known how much that sentence foreshadowed what was coming. To others, they still looked like typical teenage girls, heading to movies, gossiping about classmates, planning college visits. To Skylar's parents, they were still her best friends. To Skylar, they were the only ones she wanted to believe in, even as trust began to fade. But underneath that fragile illusion, something was shifting for good. And as the sun rose on June 2012, a smiling selfie of three girls, arms around each other, faces pressed close, would become the last photo symbolizing what the world thought their friendship was. What no one in Morgantown could see that summer morning was that one secret, one decision, had already begun to set the path that would end with a courtroom full of tears, and a young girl waiting to hear the word guilty. It was just after midnight on July 5, 2012. The air in Morgantown hung heavy with the leftover warmth of a summer day and the kind of stillness that only happens when everyone else is asleep. In a small apartment on Fairfield Drive, 16-year-old Skylar Neese slid her bedroom window open with careful hands, her heart pounding not from fear, but from the rush of teenage secrecy. She had done this before, sneaking out for late-night drives with friends, always promising she'd be back before her parents woke up. Her phone buzzed with a text, "We're here." She smiled faintly, tiptoed across the floor, and slipped into the night, believing this outing, just one more talk, one more laugh, might heal the distance that had been growing between her and the two girls she once called her sisters. On the street below, a silver Toyota idled under a street lamp, headlights dimmed. Inside sat Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, both 16, both looking like any other high school girls enjoying summer break. Skylar climbed in, tossing her overnight bag onto the back seat. The three exchanged quick smiles. Sheila turned the volume up just enough to cover the sound of the doors closing. Rachel glanced at Skylar, her smile half-hearted, her fingers tapping nervously on her knee. Skylar barely noticed. She believed the tension between them would fade once the night stretched on. They drove past gas stations, fast food lights, and quiet back roads, slipping out of Morgantown's safety line and into open country. The ride began like old times, laughing at songs from the radio, telling stories they half remembered, pretending everything was okay. But Skylar's laughter didn't reach her eyes. Sheila seemed distracted, glancing into the rearview mirror too often. Rachel clutched her phone like a talisman, scrolling aimlessly, her reflection flashing in the glass. Skylar asked where they were going, joking that they could at least stop for snacks. Sheila answered lightly, "Just a quick drive. Somewhere quiet so we can talk." The hum of the engine filled the silence that followed. The road ahead narrowed, lit only by the moon and the faint, jagged outlines of trees. Skylar looked out her window, her reflection blinking back, unaware that this quiet road, Indian Creek Road, would soon hold everything that would be left of her story. At 12:46 a.m., the car slowed to a stop on a gravel clearing just across the Pennsylvania border. Crickets droned in the distance. Water trickled somewhere nearby. The girls stepped out, stretching as if it were any other casual summer night. They stood close together, their breath visible in the cooler air. Skylar laughed off the awkwardness, asking if they'd brought a lighter, something she always carried when they snuck out. Rachel fumbled in her hoodie pocket. Sheila gave a quick nod. What happened next would replay endlessly in the minds of investigators and the hearts of Skylar's parents for years. Sheila looked at Rachel and said the words that still echo through every recounting of this case. On 3. Skylar barely had time to react. 1, 2, 3. The sound of leaves shifting mixed with a sudden, muffled cry. Skylar turned, confusion flooding her face. Pain followed, sharp, instant, unreal. Her voice cracked into screams that pierced the silent field. She stumbled backward, hands outstretched, pleading for an explanation that would never come. The night swallowed her screams, the only witnesses being the isolated stars above and the rustle of wind through branches. The attack was frenzied and desperate, punctuated by Skylar's cries for them to stop. Her strength fought until it broke, her pleas fading into a silence that no one could mistake for peace. When it was over, The two girls stood breathing heavily under a pale sky beginning to hint at dawn. The ground where they stood was too hard to dig. Their hands were stained, their voices gone dry with shock. They dragged Skylar's body toward a hollow patch by the tree line and covered her with rocks, dirt, and branches, making a crude grave that barely hid what they had done. Nearby, Skylar's phone flickered on, a single notification lighting the screen. The glow cast a ghostly light across her still face before it faded for good. Sheila and Rachel turned away, sat wordlessly in the car, and drove off. The drive back into Morgantown was quiet. Tires hissed against the pavement, the hum of the engine masking the heavy things neither dared say. Rachel stared out the window, her eyes wide and unseeing, while Sheila hummed softly to the radio, as if forcing normalcy back into the night. The clock on the dashboard read 3:08 a.m. The same roads they drove so many times before now seemed endless, their headlights cutting through a world that no longer felt real. As they crossed the bridge back into town, the streetlights flickered in the reflection of the windshield, cold and hollow. They would show up the next afternoon smiling, telling Skylar's parents they hadn't seen her since they dropped her off. And even then, they'd hug Mary Neese at the door, saying they were worried too, their faces clean of anything resembling truth. By daylight, the first whispers of concern would start. A missing girl, open windows, an unanswered phone. But on that dark morning, as the sun crept up over the hills of West Virginia, two teenagers went home covered in the evidence of something irreversible. Skylar lay alone, hidden beneath the quiet earth, a world still spinning above her, completely unaware of what had just vanished. The next morning, when her father quietly opened her bedroom door and saw her empty bed, it would take only a heartbeat for denial to fade into terror, because somewhere deep down, he already knew she wasn't just gone. She was never coming home. By the end of summer 2012, Skylar Neese had been missing for weeks that stretched into months, and what began as quiet hope slowly turned into an ache that filled every corner of Morgantown. Flyers faded on telephone poles, the childlike handwriting of her name nearly washed away by rain. Her parents still kept a porch light on every night, waiting for footsteps that never came. Police had searched nearby woods, rivers, and abandoned roads, but all they found were rumors. Friends spoke in hushed tones, some insisting Skylar ran off, others sensing something far worse. Sheila, Eddie, and Rachel Schoaf remained fixtures in the front row of public empathy, crying in interviews, organizing vigils, posting messages online asking for Skylar to come home. But detectives noticed what others didn't. Their unity seemed too smooth, their stories too aligned. By late October 2012, investigators had combed through traffic camera footage, text messages, and phone records. It didn't take long to spot a discrepancy. The data showed the girls' phones pinging in a remote area near Blacksville, not anywhere near Star City where they claimed to have dropped Skylar off. The pattern was precise yet impossible to explain if their version was true. A detective later said it was like watching a puzzle rearrange itself, one false piece at a time. When they were brought in for questioning separately, both girls recited the same sentences, the same times, the same tiny details, almost perfectly rehearsed. Nothing in the real world ever matches that perfectly. To investigators, it was the first loud crack in a shell of lies that had appeared seamless. At University High, whispers traveled down corridors as seasons shifted. Students noticed Rachel pulling away, her once confident posture replaced with withdrawn looks and tear-stained cheeks. Teachers described her as distracted and restless. Sheila, on the other hand, carried on almost carelessly, posting inside jokes online and even laughing at vigils meant to mourn her friend. It unsettled those who saw it, though few dared say so aloud. The Neese family, already worn from endless nights of uncertainty, began to trust their instincts over sympathetic smiles. Dave Neese started telling journalists he no longer believed his daughter ran away. He just didn't have proof of what really happened or who was responsible. Detectives built a map covering nearly an entire wall at the station. Red circles marked cell tower hits, blue lines tracked supposed drop-off points. The chain of evidence began to form its own story, one that no friendship could explain away. By early winter, social media posts that once portrayed concern began to look more like mockery in hindsight. Underneath public sympathy, something in Rachel's expression started giving her away. Her church friends noticed she wasn't singing anymore. Her parents described sudden breakdowns that came out of nowhere. Guilt is heavier than silence. It leaks through body language long before words. December turned bitterly cold, and for the first time since Skylar vanished, the case shifted from missing person to suspected homicide. Rachel's mother brought her to counseling in mid-January 2013 after a sudden outburst during a church youth event. That same weekend, she disappeared for 2 days without a word. On January 3, 2013, at 9:40 p.m., detectives received a call from an attorney representing the Show family. Rachel wanted to talk. It was the kind of call that turns silence into heartbeats, the one investigators wait months to hear. When detectives met her, she looked hollowed. Sunken eyes, hands shaking as she held a crumpled napkin. There was no preamble, no plea for sympathy. Her voice cracked only once as she said 2 words that would change everything. "We stabbed her." The room froze, but Rachel didn't stop there. She told them Skylar hadn't run away, that Sheila was there, and that they had planned it together for weeks. When detectives asked why, she simply whispered through tears, "We didn't like her anymore." Every person in that room would later say it was the coldest truth they ever heard spoken. That confession ripped through Morgantown faster than news could print it. People refused to believe it at first. The names didn't fit the crime. These were girls who traded birthday gifts and rode the same bus. Parents wrestled with the horror that this violence came not from strangers, but from within their own community. Detectives pressed for proof. Words alone wouldn't be enough to close a case this painful. Rachel promised she would show them where to find Skylar. She agreed to lead investigators to the exact location. Deep in Greene County, Pennsylvania, off a narrow dirt road known only to locals who hunted or fished the area. On January 16, 2013, as wind gusts swept through patches of frozen ground, detectives followed Rachel through heavy brush and uneven terrain. Her steps were unsteady, eyes fixed on the distance. When they reached a small clearing near Morris Run Road, she stopped suddenly and pointed. The snow was ankle-deep, but beneath the hardened surface, evidence waited: stones, branches, and a shallow impression carved by desperate hands 7 months earlier. The officers exchanged glances. One marked the coordinates, another called for the forensic team. Rachel didn't look back as they led her away. The quiet that filled that clearing was unlike any silence they'd known. It wasn't peace or closure, just the sound of truth beginning to thaw beneath melting snow, revealing a story no one in Morgantown was prepared to face. When Rachel Schoaf's confession reached Morgantown, the illusion of innocence shattered overnight. News broadcasts replayed the words that no one could process, and for the Neese family, shock turned into a kind of strength rooted in sorrow. Crowds gathered outside the Monongalia County Courthouse as camera crews arrived, capturing faces too young to belong on courtroom steps. Rachel, wearing an oversized sweatshirt and trembling hands cuffed at her sides, was escorted quietly past reporters who shouted questions she couldn't answer. It was May 1, 2013, nearly 10 months after Skylar vanished. For the first time, someone was admitting what happened that night. Rachel agreed to cooperate, to tell the truth fully, and she was charged with second-degree murder in exchange for her testimony. Her soft words said more than any headline. "We didn't like her anymore." America listened in disbelief, the sentence echoing through every home that had once called their own teens safe. Sheila Eddy's life, however, played out differently. In public, she smiled for cameras, waved ironically on social media, and acted as if nothing touched her. Friends distanced themselves, whispering that something about her calmness felt wrong. Investigators knew it too. Every lie she told sounded polished, deliberate, almost proud. By September 2013, evidence against her mounted. Matching knife wounds, DNA traces in her car, and text messages that matched timelines Rachel had described. Yet Sheila continued to deny involvement, claiming Rachel was lying for attention. It was a defense that crumbled the more she spoke. The town that once found her charming now saw only arrogance. Parents pointed to her as a warning that danger sometimes wears a familiar face. Through it all, Skylar's parents sat quietly in court hearings, their grief heavy but dignified, determined to see their daughter's truth reach the surface. Months of preparation led to the day everyone in Morgantown had circled in their hearts, the start of Sheila Eddy's trial. Inside the courthouse, rows of family members and classmates waited, faces drawn with exhaustion and curiosity. Reporters typed softly, trying to capture what justice would look like for a teenage murderer. Sheila entered wearing a plain jumper, her hair tied back as if the simplicity could erase her past. Across the courtroom, Mary and Dave Neese sat close together, not looking at her once. Mary had said in interviews that she would never understand how two girls she fed, hugged, and trusted could take her only child from her. In a quiet voice, she told a reporter, "They smiled in my kitchen after my daughter was gone. That's what I can't forgive." That sentence broke even the most composed viewers. It wasn't anger, it was heartbreak spoken from a place beyond recovery.